Good evening. You're watching Asia in Review, and we're going to be having a very sensitive and interesting discussion about the China-U.S. news media imbalance. And to put this all in perspective, to help us with this conversation, we have two special guests in the studio with us. The first is the lady here I'd like to introduce to you, and for some of you who are regular ThinkTech fans, you'll recognize her. This is Jiang, and Hong is the host on Asia in Review on Tuesdays. But here's what you, right? Is it on Tuesdays?
Yes.
It's Tuesdays, right?
Yeah.
And what you probably don't know about Hong is that she is also the Deputy Regional Director of NTD-TV, which is the independent U.S.-based Chinese TV network, New Tang Dynasty Television.
That's correct.
And she's also an associate professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Correct?
That's right.
So we got all these credentials for Hong Jiang, and it's nice to have you here. I know this is an unusual role.
Great to be here. I like to be sitting here instead of your chair.
But we also have another very special guest. You have seen him before here on a ThinkTech Global broadcast a number of times. This is Mr. Kerry Gershaneck. And Kerry, nice to have you back with us again.
David, good to be here with you and Hong.
And for those of you who don't know, Kerry is a former U.S. government public affairs official who teaches strategic communications at Hawaii Pacific University. And in your former life with the U.S. government, I believe you were a senior Marine officer, and you did intel work and all kinds of other interesting stuff.
Part of what I did was intelligence work, so a little bit of background in what we're about to discuss.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the rather skewed imbalance that the Chinese media has here in the United States when compared with the number and significance, influence of U.S. journalists in China. To put it all in perspective, there are some 700 Chinese journalists here in the United States, and on the other side of the teeter-totter, there are only 20 or so U.S. journalists in China. And I think it's important to recognize that China, like any other country, has two types of power. One is the hard power, and we know that through the embodiment of the PLA, or People's Liberation Army. And we have seen an example of their hard power when the Chinese Navy recently brought a ship here to Pearl Harbor. And Kerry, as I recall, you were there at the dock when that ship came in.
3 ships came in an effort to improve cooperation between the U.S. Pacific Fleet and the People's Liberation Army, Navy, which is the proper name for it. And a good search and rescue exercise was conducted, and a lot of good outreach on that part of our relationship with China. That's what we ought to be doing, engaging.
So that's an example that we have here in Hawaii. We've seen a little flash of the People's Liberation Army Navy.
Yes. Right
here at Pearl Harbor, and in fact, at what wharf or dock was that at? Do you remember?
Well, it was at Pearl Harbor, and the key wall. All 3 ships, or 2 ships, were aligned on one key wall, and then one other ship adjacent to the main frigate. But that is simply an indication of the widespread reach now that the People's Liberation Army Navy has throughout the world.
That's right.
It's not just coming here to Hawaii now. It's that flotilla left from here to go to New Zealand and Australia. Others are in the Gulf of Aden. Others are going around the world, literally, to demonstrate that in the past 5 years especially, the Chinese Navy has developed astronomical capabilities compared to what they had previously. It's just a geometric improvement over what they were able to do before.
And as kind of an interesting related point to this hard power, because we're going to get to the soft power, which is the media and influence operations here in the United States. We'll get to that in a moment. But on this issue of hard power, one item that I saw that came to mind was a photograph that I believe you showed me of that ship. And it kind of interesting in that photograph that at Pearl Harbor, as a demonstration of engagement and peace and harmony. Do you recall the sailors, the Chinese sailors from the People's Liberation Army Navy, standing on the side of the ship by the railing there? You remember that picture?
For a country that is very good at message control, the message and the visuals were not harmonious.
They were out of sync.
They were very out of sync.
So what was out of sync?
Well, the banners was basically, to synopsize it, it's talked about friendship between the People's Republic of China and the United States. The theme was entirely about friendship and working together to bring peace. Standing behind that lengthy rectangular banner along the side of the ship.
Okay, so picture this, ladies and gentlemen, now, okay?
Rectangular banner. Were about 20 sailors,
okay,
perfectly aligned in height, carefully selected.
Dress whites.
Dress whites, looking very snappy.
So far, that picture minus the banner would be what you would see a U.S. Navy calling at any port.
Calling at any port.
Right. No banner, but dress whites, maybe.
Right.
Okay. Go ahead.
And all eyes right to their commander.
Okay.
And all bearing at port arms very lethal submachine guns.
Right here at Pearl Harbor.
Right here at Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
So it's not unusual for them to come in with weaponry on their ships. They're coming in warships, and that's what they were out at sea to do, was learn how to conduct naval operations, specifically battle at sea. That was the real reason they go out to sea.
But it's the visual
disconnect was, be friendly or else. Because we have guns now, and we're willing to use them. That's really what the visual came across. It was ironic. Just not a lot of thought went into the way that they posed that particular shot. Should have been unarmed if they really wanted to convey friendship.
Let's move now from the talk of the hard power to soft power, and that's the Joseph Nye concept of the other things that a country does to influence people to like it, to overlook its deficiencies or defects. And that's where we get into this tremendous imbalance between the media that's in the U.S. from China and the U.S. media that is in China. Tremendous differences. And so as these systems are wildly out of balance, Kerry, let me ask you first, what is the U.S. perspective of China as influenced by our media? How does the U.S. view China?
I think if you look strictly at what the news media reports, by and large, with the exception of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times periodically, by and large, the image when we address China in general, it's either of an occasional scandal, but basically a benign image that we get of China. We don't get the sense that of the military buildup, the incredible military buildup that has actually taken place in the past decade. We don't get any sense at all through the U.S. news media of any malignant intent on the part of the People's Republic of China's government, which is the Communist Party of China. You hardly ever see the word communist in any of the coverage. That is significant because people would associate, if you did, they understood that the CPC, the Communist Party of China, was leading that country. It's the same government that killed somewhere between 50 million and 80 million Chinese since it came to power in 1949. That's more than any other foreign country has killed in terms of Chinese in the history of the world. And if you go with a higher number, which is given by a credible source, that's more than were killed in all of World War II.
So we're talking about the perception of a country and its people as shaped by the media. Mm-hmm. All right, and so let's take this now, and Hong, let me go to you. Same question. What is the perception of the Chinese leadership, government? What's the portrayal of the United States that you see in China?
What's interesting, talk about the media's influence, and the Chinese media and the U.S. media cannot be spoken in one breath, just because Chinese media, as we all know, are censored. The media portray of what U.S. is basically is a message from the Chinese Communist Party, from the Xinhua, from the People's Daily, from China Daily, and all other newspapers are all part of the Chinese Department of Propaganda. And it's been seen U.S. portraying the U.S. as I would say more of as a not quite a enemy. Enemy was a language during the Cold War, but now it's more as a opponent, not even like a benign competitor. I think more portrayed as a opponent. They are going to kind of press us down as we try to rise, and that's where a lot of this very intense feeling of a nationalism also come.
Is there a generation of fear about the United States by the Chinese media in China, that the U.S. is going to do something?
Right now, it's not portrayed like U.S. is our enemy, is going to attack us or anything like that. It's more of what's our mission? Our mission is we're rising as a great nation and great power, and the U.S. is in the way. And ideologically, they're in the way. They're criticizing us all the time. And the Chinese media portray any foreign media criticism of Chinese government as a criticism of Chinese people. They kind of consciously confuse the two.
I want to before we go to a break here, I want to read something to the two of you, which kind of sets the tone for what we're going to talk about the rest of the show. And this is from who's Zhanfan? Help me pronounce the name. How is this gentleman's name?
Zhanfan.
Zhanfan, who's the president of CCTV. And he says the first social responsibility and professional ethic of media staff should be understanding their role clearly and being a good mouthpiece. Journalists who think of themselves as professionals instead of as propaganda workers are making a fundamental mistake about their identity. Now, is that a philosophy that's correct and to be applied to the Chinese media, Hong?
I think that's very accurate.
And who is this chap?
And this chap, CCTV, that's the Central Chinese TV station, and that is the organ of the party, basically. It's in
tied
the TV
directly
media.
in with the party?
Yes. It's a Chinese Central TV that's tied, seeking guidance, getting guidance directly from the party. And CCTV has many stations, and all of their stations, they air different programs, but all of them are basically the guide under the guidance of the party.
And they are here in big numbers in the United States.
You are right. Yeah.
Yes.
And you know what? When we come back from the break, let's talk about what the numbers are here in the United States and what they are doing here and how they operate to influence not only the perceptions back home in China, but also the perceptions here in the United States, because they are helping to shape the view of China that is held by many or most Americans.
Yes.
So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back after the break. This is a ThinkTech Global broadcast. You're watching Asia in Review with our special guest, Hong Jiang, and Mr. Kerry Gershaneck. And we'll see you on the other side.
Good evening. We're delighted that you've come to us today. We are here for ThinkTech Hawaii. Important issues, important people, people who talk too much. It's all right. You haven't got anything else to do.
Hello. Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of ThinkTech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our ThinkTech on OC16 show. This week on ThinkTech on OC16, we'll take a look at the Honolulu Century Ride organized by the Hawaii Bicycling League on Sunday, September 29th. This was the 32nd Century Ride, and thousands of riders showed up. It was a beautiful day and a beautiful experience for the people involved. There's always a lot to come on ThinkTech. Tune in to ThinkTech on OC16. See our broadcast schedule on thinktechhawaii.com. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there. Mahalo.
I'm Bill Spencer, President of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with ThinkTech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
We're back. You're watching a ThinkTech global broadcast. This is Asian Review, and I'm your host, David Day. Our special guests are Ms. Hong Jiang and Mr. Kerry Gershaneck. And just to repeat, in case you missed the first segment of the program, that Hong is the Deputy Director of NTD TV, the New Tang Dynasty Television Network. And that is not a Chinese state-controlled media.
It's US based.
It's U.S. based.
Yeah.
You're independent.
That's right.
You have nothing to do with Beijing.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Just testing, just testing.
That's right.
And Mr. Kerry Gershaneck and Kerry, nice to have you back with us. And ladies and gentlemen, Kerry is a former U.S. Government official, a specialist in public affairs and strategic communication. And in his former life, he's done a number of very interesting things as a former senior Marine officer in Intel, and we won't go into all of that. Now, our topic that we're talking about here is the U.S.-China news imbalance. And Kerry, why does this topic really matter? Why is it significant?
Because the People's Republic of China, David, is an authoritarian dictatorship. I talked about the fact that PRC, the Communist Party of China, has killed a large number of Chinese people, more than any other foreign country in the history of the world. They killed a lot of Americans too. And the majority of Korean War casualties, American and Allied, came from the Chinese intervention on behalf of a very oppressive dictatorship in North Korea. Most people don't know that there were more than 300,000 Chinese in the Vietnam War, and they claimed credit for taking out 2,000 American aircraft during the war. So they killed a lot of Americans there. As an authoritarian dictatorship, they have no regard for the rule of law. They do not teach anymore. As of March, they stopped teaching human rights. They stopped teaching universal rights like freedom of religion, freedom of the press in their universities. It just doesn't exist there. So it's not like we're talking about France. It's not like we're talking about the Republic of China, Taiwan. It'd be a whole different issue if we're talking about democracies in different forms. We're talking about an authoritarian dictatorship. You'd said earlier, you and Hong were discussing that maybe the Chinese news media doesn't instill this sense that America is the enemy. It just merely needs to be shunted aside as China rises. Well, let me tell you, if you read the translations of their military doctrinal publications, we are the enemy. We are the #1 enemy. They are planning to sink the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Now, in certain terms, you don't need to read Chinese to get this. Incidentally, there's very good professors out there, like Professor June Teufel-Dreyer at the University of Miami, who translates these. She reads them in Chinese, and she translates their military publications. We are the enemy that is to be destroyed. No uncertainty about that in the minds of the officers and other CPC officials. So it matters. The view of the Chinese officials today goes back 2,500 years. Sun Tzu, the great philosopher, is always alluded to by people who may or may not know what he really meant, but in this case, the Chinese government knows. And what they live by is, and I'm quoting here, "For to win 100 victories and 100 battles isn't the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill." That is, get the enemy to quit or not even know they're under attack until it's too late.
And that's where the significance of influence operations or media is a piece of the influence operation.
Absolutely.
It becomes really powerful.
It is the information battlefield is the battlefield that China has taken to right now to do war with us.
Before we move on to the show, I want to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, as the audience, to follow with me very closely on this and to kind of think back over your emotions over the last few minutes as Mr. Kerry Gershaneck was speaking. And Hong, did you notice that, did you have any kind of reaction at all, positive or negative, when Kerry used the word authoritarian dictatorship?
It's interesting that's how I feel the government is. And
okay.
But if you look at the Chinese media, the media is telling you that this party is your parents and they're your saviors, and without the party there wouldn't be a new China, there wouldn't be the good life of Chinese people. So a lot of Chinese people are, for lack of a better word, brainwashed to think of the party very differently.
Let me talk to the audience here for a second. When Kerry was talking, I suspect that perhaps you or some of you had a negative reaction when he was referring to the government in Beijing as an authoritarian dictatorship. And the reason you had that reaction is that's not politically correct.
Right.
And the reason you
It's
had
China bashing.
it's called China bashing. And the reason that you have that perception is because your views of China, like the Chinese people, have been skewed by the influence of the media from China here in the United States. Yes?
Partly.
Partly.
A big part of
Okay.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and the China bashing is simply it's a propaganda technique, as it's a rhetorical technique.
It's like calling
as well.
somebody racist, right?
Right. It immediately undermines your credibility. But in the case of Hong and myself, Hong is from China. She knows. She's seen the belly of the beast. I can't be accused of it because I put my life on the line as a U.S. Marine to defend Chinese. Unfortunately, from other Chinese,
Sure.
but I was willing to give my life to defend Chinese. So China bashing doesn't work with us, which is why we're able to say what others may be too self-conscious or feel too intimidated through
Right.
the politically correct environment that we have in academia, the news media, and other key institutions in the U.S.
And that's what's so powerful about ThinkTech and the types of programming that we can do is that we can do things that the regular media either doesn't have the intestinal fortitude or they don't have the depth to be able to do that. And this is a really good example of this. So let me go to you, Hong, for a question here. Let's talk about being a reporter in China for a minute here. Let's take what's the difference between foreigners and Chinese being a reporter in China? What kind of constraints are they operating under?
Let me make a disclaimer first. So I'm representing the NTD TV locally here, and so NTD TV, Newtown Dynasty Television, is based in New York. And so I'm not really officially representing the TV station, but just from my work helping with the media here, with the NTD TV station here, and I also teach at UH on China. So from these experiences and the knowledge, NTD TV has reporters from China, but they are not identified. Not like, oh, I'm a proud reporter of this NTD television, I'm reporting from China. No face, because the station NTD is based in the US and is broadcasting uncensored news to everybody in the world, and the station is censored by the Chinese government. Basically, Chinese government doesn't like it, so you can't really openly report it. Of course, you hear a lot of stories of foreign journalists being detained and forbidden from reporting on many different things in China.
Kerry?
There's an organization called Reporters Without Borders, and the recent report from them says, and I'm quoting, "China is the biggest prison for journalists, bloggers, and cyber dissidents." Every week, the Chinese news media, owned by the government by and large, receives direction on what they're allowed to print and what they're not. And you go to jail if you release that. If you're a reporter in China and you release what that censorship guidance is from the Chinese Communist Party Department of Propaganda, you go to jail for disclosing it. New York Times did run a list that was leaked, and it includes such issues as hunger strikes by Ai Weiwei, the famous artist. Nothing to do about the tainted milk scandal while the babies were dying from the contaminated milk. You cannot, it always has to be happy news. No negative news is number 5 of this particular listing. No negative news is allowed on front pages of newspapers or the headlines, news sections of websites. So you're living, your freedom, certainly your job, your income, your family's well-being depends on this. You know better than to cross the party because there's no place to go. In the United States, you can get a job someplace else. In China, once you're kicked out of the news media, you have no place else to go, and your family suffers. Right. So it's very, very difficult to be a reporter in China who does anything other than follow the Communist Party direction.
Okay. How does the whole process of media censorship work in China? You know, following on what Kerry has just been talking about, that there's this list that's sent out of verboten topics. You know, You will not write about this.
That's right. Well, I think it's Kerry's right on the mark. Media in China is a propaganda mouthpiece in many cases, because the government has this directive, and then since a few years ago, even during Hu Jintao's time, there was this regulation that everybody has to quote the Xinhua for any news report. You cannot quote anybody else. So you see this media being syndicated, articles being syndicated in many different media outlets, but they are basically coming from the same source.
Well, what about the concept or the argument that you hear some people make that China doesn't need a Western style democracy, and they don't need a press freedom and all that kind of stuff, and that censorship in China is the way you really ought to run things?
That's really, I think, part of the brainwashing of the Communist Party, of all the Chinese people, and carrying that message to the world to say, well, we know this is a big country, it's a different culture, and we have different concepts, and therefore we don't have the same needs. We don't have the same requirements for dignity. So that itself is a big topic. But the Chinese have this concept of rights from the ancient times. It's not a vacuum there at all.
Kerry, what's your reaction to this?
Well, I would say that it's one, racist. What is it about the Chinese people that they aren't entitled to the universal rights that every other peoples in the world is entitled to?
Interesting point.
And then all you're doing when you say that, and we have friends here in the overseas Chinese community who actually believe that, who have parroted the Communist Party themes on this to me repeatedly.
I've noticed
all
that.
you're doing is
You're not
parroting.
alone.
Yes, you're simply parroting an authoritarian dictatorship's rationale or its justification for it to stay in power as an authoritarian dictatorship. That's all. Finally, it's patently not true. Look at the Republic of China. Look at Taiwan. Taiwan has successfully moved by itself, encouragement from the U.S., I'll grant you, by itself from authoritarian regime to a very vibrant, thriving democracy with freedom of the press, freedom of speech, great economic strength. So there's nothing inherently different about the Chinese people. They may adapt our democracy, our rights, make them uniquely suited for their country. That's okay. But to say that they can't live that way, that's just not Chinese, is again racist.
What's interesting is that these rights are actually guaranteed in the Chinese Constitution. The Constitution said it allows the people the freedom to gather, all these rights that we talk about. It was written there.
It's very similar to our own Bill of Rights in many respects.
That's right, except that the Chinese government is the biggest violator of that right.
We'll come back after the break, and we're going to be talking about possible accusations and whether there's any truth to it of the U.S. having a state-controlled news media when we come back after the break. So stay with us.
Hi, I'm Steve Petranek, editor of Hawaii Business Magazine, and I'm going to be part of Newsmorphosis 3, a look at online news in Hawaii. And along with me there will be Patty Epler of Civil Beat and HuffPost Hawaii, Malia Zimmerman of Hawaii Reporter, Jared Kuroiwa of KHON, and moderating us all is Howard Dykes of Hawaii News Now. If you want to know how Hawaii it gets its news now and will be getting it in the future, you need to be at Newsmorphosis 3. That's at 11:30 on October 24th at the Plaza Club. See you then.
Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of ThinkTech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our ThinkTech on OC16 show. This week on ThinkTech on OC16, we'll take a look at the Honolulu Century Ride organized by the Hawaii Bicycling League on Sunday, September 29th. This was the 32nd Century Ride, and thousands of riders showed up. It was a beautiful day and a beautiful experience for the people involved. There's always a lot to come on ThinkTech. Tune in to ThinkTech on OC16. See our broadcast schedule on thinktechhawaii.com. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there. Mahalo.
We're back. I'm David Day. You're watching or listening, depending on your choice of your computer selection there, to ThinkTech's Asia in Review. Our topic this evening is the U.S. China News Imbalance. And our special guests are Ms. Hong Jiang and Mr. Kerry Gershaneck. And we're going to run back into a little bit different issue than I talked about before the break here. We'll get into in a moment the accusation of the state-controlled media here in the U.S. But before we do that, at the outset of this program, Hong, we talked about the China hard power and the China soft power, and the media being on the soft power side of the ledger. And what's the purpose of the China soft power or its direction here in the U.S.?
What's interesting is that you mentioned about how many news agencies are coming into the U.S. The Xinhua News North American headquarters is right in the middle of New York's Times Square. And Washington, D.C. has other China Daily. And China Daily is also embedded in Washington Post's website. So to see how much embedded the Chinese media has been, and also we have the Confucius Institute, even in Hawaii we have it. So what are they doing here,
what
right?
Are they doing?
It'd
Yeah.
be great if they come in to share and add to the diversity of the U.S. The thing is that all of these are controlled by the government, and you know immediately what they are about. They're really about advancing the agenda of the government, the whole concept, the whole interest of the Chinese Communist Party,
So the purpose
not
of
the people.
So the purpose of the whole soft power approach to the U.S. through the media is to present or spin the image of China to an image that is comfortable for the government in Beijing.
A favorable opinion of the government in Beijing, exactly. And they are getting very sophisticated. And the Chinese media, take Xinhua, the English news and the Chinese news are different. The Chinese news are much more censored. English news appear to be more open and making you feel that, oh, Chinese opening up. And that's part of the sophistication. They actually use a Western style reporting, but they interview somebody from China. And so this is part of it. And the other thing is that like a Confucius Institute, that's run by the government, Chinese government. And here at UH, they've been having these annual lectures, and the people they invite would talk about China as an example of human rights improvements.
Interesting.
I won't go into too much about that, but yesterday I sat through their speech given by a former senior U.S. official who was very much in the Beijing camp, and
Right.
that Confucius Institute event. In the 2 solid hours, this individual failed to criticize the Communist Party of China once, alluded mildly to there may be some corruption, quote, depending on how you define corruption, and then savagely attacked U.S. policies and those of our allies like Japan and the Philippines for that entire 2-hour period in what I could only describe as a remarkably cynical, sarcastic, and insulting presentation. So again, the Confucius Institute, these other these news organizations aren't news organizations. They are influence organizations, part of the Department of Propaganda of the Communist Party of China, directed out of Beijing. To have watched Xinhua compared to the other news organizations that were here during APEC, I watched them because I was there working with
Right.
the news media. And Xinhua goes in, their people it's like a platoon of soldiers. They sit there in the morning, all 12 of them or so. They're receiving instructions on what they're supposed to do. All the other news journalists, Americans, they're all doing what American journalists do, and that's working in their own, being protective of their work and all that. They were receiving orders from the sergeant as to what they're going to cover, how they're going to cover it. Not necessarily unusual for a news organization, but basically their themes were being presented to them and what they were going to report as news. Very rigid, very authoritarian and controlled.
Let's probe down a little bit deeper on this point. We've got a caller on the line now from
Yes.
Houston, Texas. And so Mr. Michael Sikarsky. Mike, are you there?
Hey, David, how you doing?
We're doing terrific, and I thank you for joining us here. Mike, we're talking about the massive imbalance between the news media present here in the U.S. from China and the U.S. reporters that are operating under severe restraints in China. And you, as an executive, have spent something like 3 decades working in China, and I wondered, can you enlighten us or give us a different or your own perspective on this?
Well, I don't know if it's different from what you've already been discussing, but as you know, foreign reporters have to be licensed in China and registered and basically accountable to the government for where they live, where they go, and what they report on, which is different from foreign reporters operating in the U.S. So they have to operate in a highly structured situation.
You know, we had talked about earlier in the show, Mike, about the party's claim to govern in China is dependent both upon its the hard power, the PLA, and the soft power on the propaganda side, which is in part this whole media topic. And how do these two areas break out in terms of budget expenditures within China?
Well, when you look at the party/government budget and you break it out, military or defense, security, and propaganda, those are the two largest expenditures. And I saw a number for propaganda. It's now a couple of years old, but it was an extraordinary number, well over $100 billion for propaganda.
$100 billion just for propaganda?
Correct. Now, that propaganda is quite a large structure in China. So you've got, Kerry was just talking about Xinhua, so you've got CCTV, you've got Xinhua, you've got the State Council Office of Information, and then there are several other organizations. So that 100 billion is spread out over quite a wide range of activities, organizations. Most of the state-owned enterprises and also many civil groups have propaganda members embedded in them.
So the propaganda machine is the media machine in China, very pervasive amongst business organizations and businesses in China.
Oh, certainly. If you take someone like CCTV, which I think is a great organization, and I started working with CCTV when I first went to China, they've got great people, but they are part of the propaganda machine, and so you have to be able to pick and choose between what's propaganda and what's business. They're sort of like a Chamber of Commerce type organization.
Okay, Mike, I want to interrupt you for a moment here. We're going to go to a break for a second here, and would you just hang on the line with us?
Sure will.
That'd be great.
Good evening. We're delighted that you've come to us today. We are here for ThinkTech Hawaii. Important issues, important people, people who talk too much. It's all right. You haven't got anything else to do.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
We're back. This is a ThinkTech global broadcast. You're watching Asian Review, and I'm your host, David Day, and I'm here with Mr. Kerry Gershaneck and Ms. Hong Jiang, and we're talking about the China-U.S. news imbalance, and we have on the line with us from Houston, Mr. Michael Sikarsky, who is a 3-decade-plus business executive working in China. And Mike, just to finish up our conversation with you, can you describe for our audience the kind of the various groups of Chinese journalists and reporters that you've experienced over the years?
Sure. I differentiate them into three groups. The first one is what I call the true believers, and these are journalists, reporters who really feel that they have a critical mission to tell the story, and they do. And as a result, they also enjoy a lot of perks and rewards for doing that. And the mobility, upward mobility of those true believers is usually quite fast, quite complete, and it leads to a really good lifestyle.
So they get to have their, what do they get, perks? Kids get to be educated overseas, they get to travel.
Yeah, they're well paid, and they get a lot of privileges, and when they go overseas, they live very well overseas. Their families and their child can study overseas. So it's a real nice position to have. And then there are what I call the untrue believers, and the untrue believers.
What are they like?
Well, the untrue believers, they really don't believe what it is they're propagandizing. They have a different view of how the system works, but they game the system to get the same rewards and the same perks that believers get. And they also travel. Their children also go overseas to study. Then you have the dropouts, and the dropouts are journalists who rather early in their career arrive at the conclusion that they can't take this propagandizing anymore. The truth is being stretched, so they drop out, and they have to stay within the ministry, so they're typically marginalized into jobs like teaching new recruits English grammar or filing news reports and that sort of thing. And the true believers, for their obedience, they're given an apartment, a rather modest stipend, and access to all the ministry services and that sort of thing. And I find the true believer, the dropouts, to be people that sort of border on the state of depression because they understand how they're caught in between the machine and what they understand life to be. And they typically have no children. They choose not to have children because they don't want to bring children into that situation. So those are the three. Well,
I mean, I guess the dropouts are really, they're really outcasts then.
Yes, they are. Yeah, they're outcasts within their own organization, and also they have a difficult time, I think, relating with the population at large, because the population at large either is propagandized or at least acquiesces in the messaging. You know, and these people do not, so they don't mix well.
Mike, let me ask you a really sensitive question that I've got to ask you, and that is, in your experience, have you seen Hawaii participate in this propagandizing process, either knowingly or unknowingly?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in the early 1980s, there was a member of the East-West Center, and I can't recall the gentleman's name, but he was instrumental in helping the ministry set up the English language daily, China Daily.
The China Daily.
The China Daily, and he was considered sort of the founder father of China Daily, and would shuttle back and forth between Hawaii and Beijing to help develop China Daily. And I think that they had an anniversary, I forget what anniversary it was, 30-year anniversary or something. And he was certainly singled out for his contribution to that effort. And basically what China Daily is it's the English newspaper arm of the propaganda ministry, and so they message the propaganda line through China Daily.
Okay. Well, Mike, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to call into the show here, and we'll look forward to seeing you when you get back to Honolulu here.
Okay. Thank you very much. Take
All
care.
right. Thank you.
Bye.
Kerry, let me ask you a question here. We're coming down to the home stretch of this program here. In addition to the news media, what other means is the PRC using to influence the American public? And we've talked throughout the program here about the news media, but what else is there that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, to influence the American public, the government of the United States, to include the military, it's a massive operation. The influence operations that the People's Republic is targeted against us. It includes bringing in big business like General Motors to get them to coerce people to self-censor or to change the way that they portray the People's Republic of China. General Motors paid for a major propaganda film for the CPC called The Birth of the Party. So big business is involved. Retired generals and admirals in the U.S. Armed Forces are involved. Vice Admiral Owens, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, led an initiative, without getting too detailed, that basically was part of a PLA cover operation, People's Liberation Army cover operation under the Chinese Association of Friendly International Contacts, where they were basically getting American generals and admirals to go back to the Pentagon to stop a lot of the reporting on China, the annual report, et cetera, on China. Hollywood is very much involved. They basically have in resident PRC censors on every movie that involves China or the Chinese, down to they'll make them change out a waiter who is overweight if he's Chinese. We don't want the Chinese people portrayed that way. It's a sort of very Nazi Germany Aryan approach to how we want the Chinese people portrayed, but it also has to do with making sure that China is always portrayed as benign, harmonious, and never a threat. So it goes through think tanks in the United States. It's massive and probably the topic of an entire 1-hour radio show.
Let's do this in the future. We're running out of time here. We'll have some further shows here, and I think just to kind of to wind up here, Hong, could you? What do you see the U.S. What could we do to counter this whole imbalance in the news media? What's your view of this?
I think a fundamental thing is really if we can somehow help to be an agent of change in China in terms of how the media to allow people to have access to free media. Because I don't see the Chinese media itself in the U.S. is necessarily a bad thing if these media are free and are presenting their authentic views of the people. The problem is that there's a huge, very heavy political agenda there. And so if we can somehow, either in policy, in kind of private exchanges, to kind of give the Chinese people more of access to freedom of information, I think that's the first step.
Okay, Kerry, short answer.
Recognize we're under attack as a nation. Number 2, get reciprocity on the visas. If they deny a visa to one of our reporters, which they do routinely if they don't like what we report, we deny visas to 10 of theirs. There's a very disproportionate number of their news media in this country compared to ours in the People's Republic. Reciprocity counts, and it would be effective. And then we work through other organizations that deal with journalists from China, and work with those journalists to get them to understand more about those universal rights, and perhaps over time what they report. Over time, the changes take place within the People's Republic as we had envisioned when we first began assisting back in the early 1980s with the development of real journalism, vice the propaganda mission and the intelligence mission, oh by the way, of Xinhua and the other journalists who are here in the U.S.
Okay. I want to tell both of you that we really appreciate your time and coming to join us today. This has been it is a very controversial, it's not a politically correct topic at all. It's a very sensitive topic. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've learned something. Maybe we've rubbed you the wrong way, but we are going to do some other programs throughout the coming months having to do with China's influence here in the United States. This is just the beginning of a series. We hope you've learned something. I'm David Day for Asian Review, and Hong Jiang, thank you for sitting in the hot seat here, and Kerry, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, please have a safe drive home.